The 50s, a decade of prosperity, but not for everyone, by Professor Peter Bales. In 1947, Republicans in Congress created the House Un-American Activities Committee, UAC, to try and prove the Democrats had been sympathetic to communist subversions. UAC first went after Hollywood, and most people in the movie business quickly fell all over each other trying to prove how patriotic they were. A few brave writers and producers, dubbed the Hollywood 10, refused to be cowed into revealing their political views or informing on others, and wound up in jail for contempt. Others, including actors who insisted upon their constitutional right to remain silent, found themselves out of work and on a blacklist. A young congressman from California, Richard Nixon, used UAC to make a national name for himself by enthusiastically helping to expose the communist ties of Alger Hiss, a high-ranking State Department official. Hiss always denied he had been a spy until his death in 1996. But there was lots of evidence, like microfilm hidden in a hollowed-out pumpkin, that sure made him look guilty. Fearing Republican attacks would make his administration look soft on communism, President Truman responded by instituting the Federal Loyalty Program. This unnecessary constitution-busting legislation would, over the next few years, result in the firing of hundreds of officials and the resignation of more than 2,000. Truman's Attorney General announced a list of subversive organizations and did nothing to restrict FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's harassment of those accused. Worst of all was Congress's McCarran Internal Security Act, which required all subversive organizations to register with the government and publicize their records. Truman sensibly vetoed this bill, but was overridden. All this hysteria ultimately revealed was that communist-leaning groups in America were weak, disorganized, and in many cases in their death throes. But very few were thinking logically. This was America's second Red Scare. The original Red Scare had occurred in the aftermath of World War I. As usual, an ambitious politician would come along and try to exploit the national mood for his own personal benefit. Hardly anyone outside Wisconsin had ever heard of first-term Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy until February 1950, when during a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, he whipped out a sheet of paper and claimed he had a list of 205 communists working in the State Department. Over the next couple of years, he attacked many government agencies and waved his ever-growing list of communists around, all the while never providing tangible proof of any of his charges. He always put the list back in his pocket and never showed it to anyone. Conservative Republicans in particular, and perhaps at one point even a majority of Americans, succumbed to his rhetoric and supported his antics. Chairing a Senate subcommittee, McCarthy had the forum from which to rant against any target he desired, eventually even including former Secretary of State George Marshall. For nearly 4 years, hardly anyone had the guts to stand up to this unprincipled, self-interested politician, and a panicked nation turned inward on itself. Many schools and universities, state and local governments, labor unions, and plain old community organizations placed themselves on the lookout for Reds. Sometimes, if they couldn't find any real communists, the unpopular or vulnerable, gays and minorities in particular, were targeted and framed. Many innocent lives were ruined. To illustrate what was going on in his present-day America, playwright Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, a drama, on one level, about the Salem witch trials. With Truman not running again in 1952, the Democrats turned to Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson. Intellectual, eloquent, nuanced, exactly the kind of guy too many Americans tend to reject when they crave simple answers to complicated questions. The Republicans found an exact opposite to run for their side, former General Dwight David Eisenhower, who had been marking time in civilian life serving as president of Columbia University. Called Ike by his friends, Eisenhower had always been non-political and was so popular that both parties courted him, but he chose the Republicans. To his credit, and unlike most modern-day Republicans, Ike was never hyperpartisan, didn't believe his party was always right, and he was respectful of the Democratic opposition. During the campaign, Eisenhower came across as the reassuring nice guy, while Stevenson seemed a bit of an egghead. To keep the extreme right wing in his own party happy, Ike tossed them some red meat by choosing conservative California Senator Richard Nixon as his running mate. During the campaign, Nixon was accused of accepting illegal campaign gifts, but he saved his political career by going on live television to declare in a self-pitying but effective performance that the only gift he ever accepted was for his daughters, a cocker spaniel named Checkers. Lots of Americans did not buy it, and even Eisenhower never really warmed up to Nixon. But after the Checkers speech, he did keep Nixon on the ticket. When Ike promised he would personally put an end to the Korean conflict, his political victory was assured. He creamed Stevenson in November. The Republicans took control of the presidency for the first time since 1932. Peace talks in Korea had bogged down for 2 years. North Korea and South Korea found themselves relegated to the sidelines as two cold warriors, the United States and China, glared at each other across the line of scrimmage. China was especially embarrassed that thousands of its soldiers held prisoner by the U.S. did not want to return to their hovels in Mao's supposed communist paradise, and America refused to force them. Frustrated, Eisenhower let it be known through diplomatic channels that he might be willing to use the atom bomb to end the war. In reality, China was sick of the war and received signals from the Soviet Union to make peace. Stalin had finally died, and the new Soviet leadership was anxious to improve ties with the West. Emerging from a scrum of vodka-soaked conspirators, former World War II General Nikita Khrushchev actually denounced the excesses of the Stalin era and appeared for a brief time like he might just be someone the U.S. could do business with. Unfortunately, that would not come to pass. But the United States and China agreed to an armistice, a truce, not an official end to the war. The two Koreas were divided roughly at the 38th parallel, where the whole mess started in the first place. To this day, the demilitarized zone in between remains one of the tensest places in the world. But back then, containment had stopped the spread of communism yet again. A Red invasion had been turned back, and we avoided World War III. The cost was high, though. Over 54,000 Americans killed and 100,000 wounded in what is today sometimes called the Forgotten War. President Eisenhower could not stand Joseph McCarthy, but did not personally attack him, confiding to his aides that he did not want to get into the gutter with that guy. Remarkably, in late 1953, the Senators' subcommittee expanded its investigation to include the United States Army, making charges in hearings that were broadcast on live television. For 35 days, millions of Americans watched a sweat-drenched McCarthy expose himself as a shameless witch hunter. When he faced off against the Army's lawyer, Joseph Welch, who was obviously a decent man, the television cameras made the contrast between the two palpable. A television news program called See It Now, hosted by Edward R. Murrow, also revealed McCarthy's cruel tactics. Almost overnight, McCarthy went from heroic communist fighter to embarrassing fanatic, and nobody wanted to admit they'd ever paid any attention to him. Shunned by his Senate colleagues and a pariah to all but the most extreme right-wingers, his heavy drinking rotted out his liver, and he died about 3 years later. During the 50s, inflation and unemployment generally remained under control, and despite periodic mild recessions, the American economy boomed. Many farmers, however, missed out. Innovations in fertilizer, seeds, and equipment improved their productivity so much that increased crop yields contributed to a drop in the price of their products. It's a recurring irony in American history. Farmers produce more and their profits go down. So much for efficiency. But most everybody else went on a shopping spree, snapping up deals on automobiles, televisions, washers, dryers, dishwashers, and record players. With the large-scale air conditioning of factories now practical, many traditional industries in the Northeast and Midwest pulled up stakes and headed for a sun belt that spread from Florida to Southern California, offering cheaper land and a lower cost of living. A swath of northern industrial towns left behind with abandoned factories are to this day called the Rust Belt. Starting in 1946, couples who'd put off having children during the Depression and the war got busy in their bedrooms producing a baby boom that lasted well into the 60s. Dr. Benjamin Spock wrote a best-selling child-rearing book emphasizing love and nurturing, which some conservative types still believe contributed to the hedonistic behavior many baby boomers have continually engaged in. Population trends that were present before the war accelerated in the 50s. Besides the migration from the Northeast to the South and West, young families in particular moved from the cities to the suburbs. They wanted a less crowded neighborhood and a detached house with a backyard their children could play in. Dad would drive to work and Mom would drive to a supermarket grouped with other stores in newly constructed shopping malls. African Americans, always disproportionately poor in America due to prejudice, found themselves left behind in the inner cities. Middle-class whites fled beyond the city line, white flight, and paid their taxes to their new suburban communities, leaving urban municipalities pinched for funds and straining to maintain services. Most large American cities, especially in the North and East, began a decades-long period of urban decay. Ignorant bigots blamed those people, African Americans and the increasing numbers of Puerto Ricans escaping the economic stagnation of their island to start a new life in the eastern big cities. But as always in American history, poverty was the root of the problem, not race or ethnicity. Automobiles became much fancier in the 50s, and models now came in 2- and 3-tone finishes with power steering, power brakes, air conditioning, and tail fins on the back. Lots of shallow guys believed the cooler the car they had, the more sensual they would appear to women. Lots of shallow women bought into that and preened frantically as guys cruised up and down Main Street, USA. Americans now demanded improved roadways and influenced government at all levels to cater to this car culture by building thousands of miles of new highways. So what if some old communities had to be bulldozed aside? So what if mass transportation in the cities had to be neglected? It was only those people riding the subways and buses anyway. Walt Disney spotted the automobile trend and opened a really cool theme park just south of Los Angeles that people needed to get to fast, with diners and motels along the way. Congress passed and President Eisenhower signed the National System of Defense Highways, authorizing the federal government to provide 90% of an initial $50 billion outlay for 40,000 miles of additional roadway. To justify the expense, lawmakers assured the public that all these new interstate highways will make it easier to evacuate the big cities in the event of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Yes, this was the 50s. Cars were the bomb, gas was cheap, and the freedom of the open road was calling. Lots of Americans had to find new jobs when they were supplanted by automation. After all, machines never ask for a raise or take a sick day, so many businesses love them. Industries that had been around since the 19th century declined as ever-resourceful Americans found even better ways to make a buck. Mining, steel, railroad, and textile corporations became old news with the advent of plastic, chemical, aviation, drug, and electronics companies. Kmart, Walmart, and Target discount department stores can all trace their roots to the 50s. The McDonald's Corporation started up in the 50s, demonstrating that Americans were happy to gulp down unhealthy food as long as it was served fast with fries and a Coke to go. Despite some success organizing government workers, unions remained unpopular during the decade. The old organized workers, or really commies, idiocy lingered, and then real organized labor connections to organized crime hit the papers. Mafia thugs were drawn to the enormous sums in union pension funds and tried to steal them. America experienced a religious revival in the 50s, a 20th century Great Awakening. All the rapid change and uncertainty drew folks to the comfort of church, as did a deliberate response to the militant atheism of the Soviet Union. The founder of communism, Karl Marx, had famously said, "God is dead." President Eisenhower's first inaugural parade led off with a float to God, and a hyped-up Congress cast aside our founder's precious notion of separation of church and state to add "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and "in God we trust" to our money. After World War II, societal leaders and the media emphasized traditional gender roles. Women were expected to get married, have children, and subordinate their own needs to the needs of their family. Dinner needed to be ready when the husband, the sole breadwinner, returned home from work. No wonder so many women who felt trapped in their roles as wives and mothers devoured the newly available tranquilizers by the handful. The black and white television shows of the period strongly reinforced these gender stereotypes. In 1953, Dr. Alfred C. Kinsey published his scientific study entitled Sexual Behavior in the Human Female to complement his earlier study on men. As it turned out, both men and women were enjoying a wide variety of sexual acts before marriage and basically being private about it. Gay people continued to face discrimination from the government and the general public. Hugh Hefner launched Playboy magazine in December of 1953. The magazine immediately became wildly popular among millions of men who wanted to fantasize about sex without any responsibilities, such as paying a mortgage and supporting a family. Popular music in the early 50s was mostly boring and unchallenging, but a change was in the airwaves. African American and white musicians, particularly in the South, heard each other's jazz, folk, country, blues, and gospel music on records and on the radio, and their sounds began to intermingle. African American race music powerfully vibrated and intrigued whites, who named it rhythm and blues, or R&B. In 1952, Cleveland disc jockey Alan Freed started calling the new music rock and roll, which for decades had been slang for sex. As an ever-increasing audience of white teenagers became enthralled with the black music, record companies scrambled to find a white performer who could deliver and sell the black sound. Thus arose Elvis Presley, whose slicked back hair, swiveling hips, and provocative snarl captivated young people and panicked parents. Other artists, white and black, followed, and music has never been the same since. Even though on the surface the 50s appeared to be a decade of family values, prosperity, and wholesome fun, there were critics who saw through the facade. A small group of writers challenged the mindless conformity and outraged mainstream society by scorning the Cold War, materialism, Christianity, and the nuclear family. The Beats, their followers became known as beatniks, wore black turtlenecks, sprouted goatees, and sipped cappuccino in Greenwich Village cafes in a foreshadowing of the social upheaval soon to follow in the 60s. Famous beat novelist Jack Kerouac wrote On the Road, chronicling a cross-country hitchhiking odyssey wherein he meets all kinds of eccentric people along the way. In September 1955, President Eisenhower, a smoker, suffered a serious heart attack. He resumed work about a week later, but everyone wondered whether he would run again. Then the following June, he got hit with a nasty attack of ileitis, a colon disorder that required surgery. But his recovery was swift, and he announced he would seek a second term. The Democrats nominated Adlai Stevenson again, and the perceptive guy made some very valid points about ending open-air testing of the hydrogen bomb, suspending the draft, the lack of a national health insurance program, and the federal government's refusal to help fund public education. But the public still loved the comforting style of the grandfatherly general turned president, and Eisenhower creamed Stevenson by an even greater margin than in '52. The public, however, liked Ike much more than his party, and the Democrats actually strengthened their hold on the Senate and the House of Representatives. Eisenhower infuriated the right wing of his own Republican Party because he was a moderate at heart. He had no real desire to expand the New Deal, but he did not want to roll back the reforms already in place. He did not believe the Republicans were good and the Democrats were bad, like so many of today's political simpletons in both parties. He respected the opposition and cooperated well with the Congress controlled by Democrats for 6 of the 8 years he was in office. An examination of his foreign policy will reveal he was a moderate in that realm as well. He believed communism needed to be contained, but he loathed the prospect of an all-out war. He was, and this is a well-deserved compliment, a general who had seen enough of war and hated it. The 50s had been pretty good for the white, wealthy, and middle class in the United States. But an important book, The Other America by Michael Harrington, revealed that at some point 30% of all Americans had lived in poverty. For African Americans, Hispanics, and the elderly, the situation was even worse. Poverty had different faces, from the slums of New York City to the mountains of West Virginia, but wherever they were, these visages often portrayed hopelessness, disease, and even hunger. For these disadvantaged Americans, the Cold War seemed far away and irrelevant. Most Americans back then averted their eyes from unpleasant sights, and to this day they remember the 50s fondly. A family-friendly time watching I Love Lucy on TV, hula hoops, roller skates, coonskin caps, movie stars like Marlon Brando and James Dean, parking at the drive-in, dances at the church, really cherry cars, and newfangled rock and roll on the radio. Toward the end of the decade, you could travel on a jet, and in 1959, the new states of Alaska, number 49, and Hawaii, number 50, joined the lower 48. For most Americans, but not all, the 50s ended with the American dream very much in their grasp.